right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. Today, we have an esteemed guest. I'm so excited to have this person on board with us today. She is a passionate person about the gaming industry globally. She is also a story writer and narrative writer involved in the gaming industry. She will come on and introduce herself, and we can get the ball going from there. So take it away, Chella.
Hi, my name is Chella Ramanan. I am a writer in the video games industry and a narrative designer. I used to be a video games journalist for a really long time, and I am the co-founder of Threefold Games. Our debut game is called Before I Forget. It came out last summer, and since then, we got a BAFTA nomination for Game Beyond Entertainment for that game. It's a narrative exploration game about a woman with dementia, and it seemed to strike a chord with lots of people. And then this month, we released on Xbox and Nintendo Switch, which was really exciting, so we could reach more people. And yeah, that's me. I've done a bit of freelance stuff for a few game projects, and I'm currently living in Sweden, and I'm on the narrative team as a writer for a AAA studio. So I straddle both ends of games writing in sense of scale.
Exactly. What a great background you have.
I should probably mention, also I forgot that I'm the co-founder of POC in Play, which is an organization founded to improve the representation and of people of color in games and in the games industry itself. So yeah, I forgot that one, sorry.
Right. Again, a very stellar background you have. Hopefully we can be like you at some day. So just to dive into it, so who is a story writer or a narrative writer, and what is the difference between the narrative writing and why are these fields, why are these skills so important in gaming today?
Yeah, so there's two roles. There's narrative design, and then there's writing, and it's depending on which studio you're at, those roles can be sometimes combined, they can be very separate. Yeah, sometimes it's the same person, sometimes it's very separate teams. So on Before I Forget, I was both the narrative designer and the writer. And so the difference is the writer is probably fairly clear in people's minds what that will entail. So that's, writing the dialogue, they're concerned with character, story, plot, all those things that I think everyone will be like, yeah, I get that. Whereas the narrative designer is concerned with the holistic sort of view of the story within the game and how story interacts with gameplay. So the narrative designer is more focused on the player experience, like what the player does. And the writer will be how the player experiences the story. So it'll be, writing the characters and the rich characters and things, whereas the narrative designer will be how do we use the gameplay tools that we have within this game we're making, and it depends what kind of game you're making, which tools you have, and how do we tell this story really capably with these tools. So yeah, that's a sort of a basic breakdown.
All right. So you mentioned tools, you mentioned storytelling, and how they interplay into the design process. So what sort of tools do we look at when we're trying to create player experiences and for immersive storytelling?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about the tools that we have, I mean, so basically it depends what game you're making. So if you are making, let's pick a game that lots of people know, like, so if you're playing an Uncharted style game or a Tomb Raider style game, so the tools that you have there as a storyteller is, and a narrative designer, so if we're using these two roles, so as you have cinematic cutscenes, so really sort of high quality, motion captured, like very highly realized cinematic moments, which tell sort of really dramatic bits of the plot. You also have, so some of the tools you have are climbing, you have combat moments, and the cutscenes also have key dialogue moments. You have, sometimes you have quick time events when you have to quickly press buttons. So it's sort of like a semi-cinematic, but you still can interact to get through this scene, and you have a fail state in those moments as well. So these are all things that can help you tell the story and guide the player experience. So they're all the tools that narrative designers or the narrative team, if we're including both of those roles, have, and they help you control the pacing. And it's one of the things that Uncharted is really brilliant at. So you will have, sort of beautiful character moment, and then you will fly around the globe to somewhere really fabulous and looks gorgeous. And then you will have a car chase and sliding through the mud, and Nathan Drake is sort of swinging off the back of a Land Rover, and there'll be like a combat moment probably involved in that, and so it's really high pace. And then you'll have these quiet moments again where the characters are talking to each other and you learn more about them. And so they're using all of these tools. They're using like combat, and then you have puzzles. So you have like bits where you're kind of climbing up the inside of some really beautiful sort of ancient piece of architecture. So it's like, this beautifully realized world, but it's much more meditative, and, sort of like it's got a tension to it, but it's quieter, there's no action. And then it will flip and it will go, you'll fix the puzzle, or you get to the thing, and then soldiers come, and all of a sudden you're fighting, and it's action. And so it's like a very good way of like controlling the pacing and the player experience. And that's why those games are so, they're like popcorn. You just can't stop, because you're just like, oh, I'll just play one more moment. And they roll so seamlessly into each other that, yeah, that's what they do very cleverly.
Right, sounds like different human experiences crafted into one fine silk of human experience.
Yeah.
So great. So plots. We know about plots and how stories form around plot. In terms of, if we take a film, we see the protagonist and antagonist, and that sort of and those sort of experiences. So let's dive into that a bit. Plot development and story arcs. What the usual methods we know are really about 3-act structure, hero's journey, and 7-act structure. Are there any other kind of structure or tools that we could use to talk about when we focus on plots?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are loads of different, everybody's heard of the hero's journey, I think, largely thanks to George Lucas and Star Wars. And, it was really successful for him. And, it became a blueprint for lots of storytellers to try and replicate that, that success. And then, Hollywood really loves the 3-act structure, which is, basically establishing setting and character, introducing conflict or a problem, and, sort of having rising tension, which ends in Act 3 with resolution and maybe character growth. Yeah, there are all sorts of different ones. There's 7-act structure, which I think you mentioned in your notes, which has kind of like a hook, a plot turn, and then it has these pinch points along the way, where the character is kind of backed into a corner. And yes, so all of them can be useful tools. I think, there isn't really a blueprint. As writers, we all want something that makes it easier because writing is difficult. And the 3-act structure and the hero's journey, they offer this promise of, you just follow these rules and all of a sudden you have this amazing story and it's all really cool. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. So, if you think about story starts with character, none of these things give you characters. If you think about sort of the setting and the world of your story, none of these things do that for you either. So there's still a lot of work to do. And I think, some people don't think that way, don't think in this really structural way, and, and that's okay. And I think, there's a lot of focus goes on to story structure and which method you use. And, some people have a more organic way of storytelling, or maybe they come in purely through character. They start with character and maybe the character says something interesting, or they're in a weird situation, and that's how they start their story, and that's okay. And I think these are all useful tools to have and understand and learn from, and then you pick the bits that kind of work for you. So you don't have to stick rigidly to one method, and then that's your method. Because, people complain about, films being formulaic, Hollywood, the sort of mainstream Hollywood films being formulaic. And, that's one of the problems, I suppose. We start to be able to anticipate, when the rising tension is going to come, and because we've all studied all these story structures, and yeah, so I think you still have to put all the work in on who your character is and what drives them and what their motivations are. And I think that's everybody talks about structure, but they don't talk about character as much, and they really are the engine of your story, no matter what structure you're using.
Okay, so let's just digress a bit. You mentioned character. So for the benefits of our viewers, how does any designer, any narrative writer or designer think about the character, and how do they try and interpolate that with the environment of the game or with the immersiveness that you're trying to build? From your own experience, how will you say is the best way to think about it?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, creating a character for a game isn't any different from creating a character for any other kind of story medium. The characters who live in your world. So you start with, well, you can start with all sorts of things that sort of what do they want? What do they need? Who and what do they care about? How self-aware are they of, their flaws? And, are they trying to hide them from people? Are they brazen about them? That all informs how they move through the world and how they interact with people. And I think when it's the player character is the character that you write for games that is more unusual, because obviously you are handing this character over to someone else, and they have to identify with them in a much more tangible way than they do a protagonist of a non-interactive medium. So, you know, if you think of someone like Master Chief, he's a very he's a very broad character. He's quite shallow in lots of ways. You know, he doesn't really speak. We don't know if he loved his mum. You know, we don't.
Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, that character is like an empty vessel for us to project onto so that we can feel utterly, because it's a first person game, so we can feel utterly like Master Chief. In contrast to, you know, we come back again to Nathan Drake and Lara Croft. I think up until recently, Lara Croft was kind of a middle ground between those two. So Nathan Drake, we know a lot about him and his psychology and what drives him and his childhood and his connection to Francis Drake, and then we know about his brothers and all sorts of you know, aspects of him. And Lara Croft was this kind of in between. So we knew a little bit about her. You know, she's a lady of the manor. She's British. She's posh. She's aristocracy, but she lives this kind of quite anti-establishment. Well, I suppose sort of establishment for British aristocracy, like stealing treasures from around the world. But, but she did it with more, yeah, with more guns and sort of, yeah, sort of James Bond kind of aspects to her. So yeah, there's this sort of, you have to know what kind of game you're making and then how much character your player character can have as a result of, you know, like how much you are leaving for the player to insert themselves into that character.
Right. It sounds like, again, personal experiences, life experiences. Also, sometimes we think about health experiences and how they shape the character's life. All right and good. All right, so we've noticed with recent trends with game titles like Nier Automata or the Witcher series, there's a concept of lore behind these characters. So how if local indies in Africa were thinking about building lore into their games, what is the best way to try and think about developing lore for their characters?
Yeah, well, I think developers in African nations, I mean, you're surrounded by rich lore that, you know, people outside your continent, you know, probably largely are completely ignorant to. So you are sitting on a gold mine of lore, I'd say. Yeah, there's all sorts of ways you can, you know, take, you know, and you have every right to use that lore because it's your own as well, rather than appropriating it to add, you know, exotic elements to your game. You can, yeah, sort of like tap into that deep history and all the folklore and mythology and, you know, the contemporary, you know, sort of aspects of, you know, sort of African nations and like experiences. You know, that's all lore and you sort of world building richness that people won't have experienced, that, you know, sort of firsthand, that will be really exciting to players, I think. I think people are hungry for new experiences from new perspectives that serves with authenticity, and that's what, you know, sort of African game developers can definitely bring.
Right. So just a little bit deeper into this question. We know with different cultures, there are taboos, there are different ills and norms of different cultures around the world. How do this also feature in terms of the storytelling for games? Sometimes are taboos also played out? Do people also involve taboo, structuring taboos alongside the storytelling of games? For instance, we know back in the history in Africa, especially some parts of the mid east of Nigeria, whereby twins were not allowed to live, right, until the advent of Lady Mary Slessor, who stopped that sort of cultural norm. So how does that play out? Is there any sort of relationship that plays out in games today?
I didn't know that.
Well, okay, so
yeah,
that's
I didn't. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean, it's just the same as any kind of. Yeah, just like I think it's a difficult one to. It's just basically just. They say write what you know, and that is a cliche and can limit some people, but there is an element of truth to that, especially when it's a marginalized perspective, which, like the African experience is, which is just, we've marginalized an entire continent's experience, but there we go, this is where we are. So I think it is just like thinking about ways that the taboo of twin children, how could that be interesting in a game? Does it mean that you have two players? Do you control two characters? Just thinking creatively about those taboos that I don't know, I didn't know about that until now. And it's really interesting. All of us, I'm just, thinking, oh, like, is the world in two different colors? Is, like, how do you translate that into a game? And that could be really interesting. It's really exciting.
Well, it would be great to work on something like that.
Yeah.
I could just imagine. I could just imagine the name of the game in my head. Right. So let's proceed a bit. So sometimes when you take movies, big budget movies, you see in terms of the way the script are structured. For instance, one of my favorites is the Star Wars, and I'm sure you might understand. You might understand why it's my favorite, because of the different worlds that are played and how the stories intertwine together. So I've seen a YouTube video that was done for, I think, the second installment of Star Wars, whereby in terms all the characters, all the actors were brought into like a room, and they all read their different parts out, right, from the script. Does that apply to in gaming? Do all those that practice, does it apply to for when designers are thinking about the roles and how it intertwines in the game?
Yeah, so yeah, that's called a table read. And yeah, it depends on the scale. Obviously, before I forget, we didn't have a table read because yeah, that's for sort of like the high-flying AAA games with lots of budget. So, but we did have voice actors for the game. We didn't have a rehearsal. We didn't do a table read with them, but they signed an NDA and we gave them the script ahead of time. But yeah, we didn't even have them in the same room together, which is quite often, people will be playing out these scenes like separately. But yeah, if you're looking at these big dramatic moments in big games, yeah, there will be, there's lots of casting that goes on and audition scripts are written, and yeah, then you have to get you have to get the final script so that you have time for these table reads. So, writers have to get things written in advance to allow for the best performance. That's what it's all about, is, sort of providing actors with the most ideal situation that you can for them to bring their best, to bring their A game. So yeah, you will have table reads. I've done table reads with the actors, and you just quickly sort of go through the script, and you can give notes as a writer. Hopefully the writer is in the room. Ideally, the writer will be in the room with the director and the actors. and be there to just offer insight into, you know, the whole, because, you know, if you're just doing one scene and it's a huge game, there's a lot of context that's missing that even the director won't necessarily have. So yeah, those are really important and really great to put actors at ease, which is absolutely what you want, for them to be not nervous and just feel safe to bring their best work, basically.
Right. Okay. So thanks for that. Looking into the way the stories are actually built around table reads and involving characters. Are there certain story structures that work well with table read, or work well in terms of open worlds and gaming? In terms of also branching storylines, are there certain kind of storytelling methods that work well with this, or it's an organic sort of storytelling fit?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the game that you know, the sort of experience that you want to deliver. You know, so I mean, story structure is a weird one in games, especially in open world. You know, I think games writers themselves are trying to figure out what is the best way to tell. How do you tell a satisfying story, you know, in a culture that's used to linear storytelling, you know, generally in sort of films, TV, it's generally fairly linear. In an open world game where the player can go anywhere and do anything, you know, how do you tell a satisfying story? How do you, how much do you care that the player experiences a story that you've written, or are you leaving it much more open to sort of, you know, experiential sort of gameplay, that, you know, they create their own stories within the open world? And so, yeah, it really depends on what you want to do, whether you're doing a No Man's Sky, which is, you know, this really sort of, you know, like incredibly open, and you just create your own story within it, or, you know, then there's, you know, they do have a story in there. So yeah, the structure really depends. I suppose, before I forget, is, you know, complete other end of the spectrum. It's 1 hour long. It's linear, there's no branching. And I guess if I was thinking about it before this interview, actually, because I didn't think about story structure whilst I was writing it. So I thought about character, gameplay, pacing. And I suppose thinking about it is pretty much 3-act structure. Yeah, I don't know. We think more in terms of pacing, and, you know, sort of player experience, as opposed to, is this hitting the beats of the 3-act structure, or like 5 acts, or, you know, obviously we have sort of chapters and things in these big stories we're telling, but yeah, it's more about pacing, because we have gameplay involved in the player, and allowing for all those things makes it much more.
Right. Okay. So something that just occurred to me is about delivering. There's always in everything. There's always a gap between what is planned and what is delivered. In games, that is called sometimes cognitive dissonance, right? How best can writers or narrative designers merge the gaps that arise from cognitive dissonance when delivering their stories in games?
Yeah, so I wondered about this question, what you meant by the sort of cognitive dissonance, because, you know, what came to mind was ludonarrative dissonance, which is when the gameplay is telling one story and the story is telling another, and they're kind of at odds. Is that what you mean? Like how
Yes,
to
definitely,
like,
definitely.
yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I mean, back to Uncharted again, because it's the one that everybody brings up when it comes to ludonarrative dissonance.
Yeah.
and it's the fact that, you know, Nathan Drake is portrayed as this, you know, charming, heroic. He's the hero. We love him. He's, you know, a rogue, but he's a lovable rogue. But he also slaughters, you know, like 1,000 just like grunts throughout the sort of process of the game. So yeah, so there's always that problem. And then there's think something like Animal Crossing. I almost called it A New Hope then, which is the Animal Crossing Star Wars crossover that we're all waiting for.
Yeah.
Animal Crossing New Horizons. So yeah, so when that came out, people were like talking about Tom Nook and his sort of capitalist street, because it's based on sort of a loan system that you're constantly trying to pay off. But you know, the game is selling this utopian fantasy, sort of escapism. You're on this idyllic island, you just like plant tulips and, you know, invite villagers, you know, rent free. But then Tom Nook has this huge debt hanging over you. But it's sort of benign capitalism, I suppose, because he doesn't charge interest. But there's still this kind of disconnect between this utopia and this slightly this benign capitalism of the game, the sort of core gameplay, which, you know, is the thing that keeps you playing. And I think sometimes it's kind of unavoidable for some games. So, you know, for the Uncharted games, for instance, you know, the combat is one of the, you know, if you are going to put combat as a core mechanic, gameplay mechanic in your game, then and your protagonist is nice and kind and we like them, but they also kill on sight. Which he does, and you know, there's no sort of non-lethal way to get rid of all these goons that come at you. Then you're going to have that. You know, there's no real way to avoid it in that case. I think in other games, like, you know, when you're designing your game from the ground up. So yeah, I think it's about having a game design document from the start, and that will be a living document because you iterate. You know, game development is about iteration. So you might have this idea right at the beginning and you set down what your design pillars are, you know, whether it's explore and climb and shoot or whatever it is. And then, so say you've got a game and you're like, well, we are aiming for a calm, meditative, sort of soothing experience. And then through iteration, you come upon this cool, fun mechanic that like brings tension in some way, whether it's like platforming or whether there's something that is like dangerous. And then you have to go back to look at your design document because you're like, oh, this is really cool, it's really fun. But what's happened to soothing, meditative, and do you then need to change what your design pillars are? You know, to keep them on track, or do you need to save this cool gameplay for another game? So I think it's, yeah, about having those constant design conversations about, you know, like where you want to go and what you're willing to compromise in those terms.
Right. So we've talked about several different concepts here, but in terms of storytelling, what's something we've left out, and which is also part of what you featured in Before I Forget, was about dialogue between characters in the game. So how best does any narrative designer or writer think about dialogue, and how to fit that into the storytelling and the gameplay? How does that work out?
Yeah, so dialogue in games does all the things that dialogue in other storytelling media do. So, you know, they reveal things about character, they reveal things about the world, and they move the plot on. That's what they do ideally. They do all those things. And of course, in games, they can also tutorialize. So, you know, if there's a puzzle or something, you know, two characters can maybe discuss that, or they may explain how to use something, you know, like new gameplay elements and things like that. And so as a designer, as a narrative designer, you have to think about when and how you use dialogue. So if your player has set their controller down, this is what I always think, if they've like put down their controller, they're no longer playing the game. And so, you know, the amount of dialogue you use and when you use it depends on the type of game you're making. So some games, the gameplay, dialogue is the gameplay. So if you're making Life is Strange, for instance, you know, sometimes you put the controller down because you've just been faced with this dialogue choice of doom, and you don't know which one is the right one, and you know, you don't want your whole storyline to go horribly wrong down this dark path, which you know it could do in a Life is Strange game, or in, you know, a Telltale Games game like The Walking Dead, for instance. You know, those branching narratives that give you these choices that you know will impact your entire storyline. Then that's, you know, dialogue as gameplay. And, you know, that's great and compelling, and that's what your game is all about. But if you're writing huge cinematic pieces and your player hasn't touched the controller for like 3 minutes, maybe you need to think about ways that you can incorporate gameplay into this section. You know, like, and is the dialogue doing work that can't be done in any other way? I think that's how you need to think about dialogue in games, so that you're not just, you haven't just got these robots like just dropping like throwing information at the player, when they could be exploring and finding it for themselves through gameplay and just sort of interacting with the world. So yeah, I think it's yeah, you just have to keep that in mind, basically, because, you know, it's really easy to write lots of dialogue, but it's not always the best way to tell the story, because you can tell the story in so many other ways other than a character just talking at you.
Right. Great. So back again to the way games are made and given and sold to the public, right? We see a lot of cutscenes, we see a lot of cinematics being advertised about a particular game. And looking at the narrative design process, are there different design process from a narrative point for a cutscene and a cinematic, different from what is already in the structure of the game?
I don't think so, really. In terms of the writing, I think the writing should be great on every line. Ideally, the writing is going to be great no matter how much money that scene has taken. So, you know, if it's a cinematic, it obviously is more expensive. You know, if it's got mocap and voice acting and you know, like high quality sort of visuals, whether that's animated or, and so, but the dialogue and the writing shouldn't be elevated above the rest of the game. So in terms of like writing and polish, I think ideally it will be the same no matter what kind of scene it is you're writing. I think the things that you think about are for these scenes that are, you know, going to other teams to animate, and they have to realize these things that you've written. So I think you have to think about the audio team and what's in the script. So you have to think about what's going into the script that tells them what's going on. So you have to write very good scene descriptions so that, you know, the artists can visualize exactly what's going on and who is where, and, you know, how this scene works and where it fits into the previous scene. So they have to sort of know the context. And then the audio teams, you have to sort of call out which bits need audio, because, you know, they need to be aware of like how much work they've got coming down the line. So I think it's just things like that, really. And then just deadlines, because if you've got, you know, sort of high quality cinematics, then you need to get those scripts written, you know, pretty early on so that they have the time to do their work, because you're just the start.
Yeah. Right. So when you did your introduction, you talked about your involvement with people of color. How has that helped out in the area of storytelling and narrative design? What are the areas you feel that we should or kind of like concentrate on when telling stories for people of color?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah. How has it helped me in my storytelling? I guess hook and play. I guess being the co-founder of Plug and Play has helped me find more people of color in the games industry, because, you know, they come to us now and are part of our community, and, you know, it's made me, you know, it's much easier to find games, you know, by African designers, or, you know, designers in India, and, you know a narrative designer in the Caribbean who's actually on my paternal island of Grenada as well. So she's like making games in Grenada, which is really cool. So yeah, I think in that way, it's like about community and speaking to each other. And so it's a really good source of talent. You know, like I need, you know, a UI person or something like that. And then you can go to this community. So I think it's helped in that way rather than directly in my storytelling. What was the other question?
How has that translated into you designing games from a narrative and writing perspective?
Yeah, I suppose that activism side of me, you know, that facet of me that is an activist for diverse storytelling means that I'm like constantly aware of perspectives that are underrepresented. You know, I very consciously made Sunita, and before I forget, Indian, because I could, you know, name Indian protagonists in games on like one finger, not even one hand, you know, and you know, so like Chloe in the Uncharted games is Indian by the fourth game, or the game that she was a protagonist in, but I think she was Greek Australian at inception, and she was kind of retrofitted to be Indian, which is interesting in and of itself. Yeah, and so yeah, I could see that there was just a lack of representation, and so that's why we made that decision to kind of help change that. So yeah, and I think it's just made me aware of, because I'm constantly looking at different perspectives, you know, like aware of the Indigenous struggles around the world, and yeah, sort of just reading people's stories, I suppose, helps inform my stories. Yeah.
Great. So something, of course, that is of great importance now with the advent of COVID and with the way production in the gaming industry or in the film industry has gone about is that we see the development of tools either by on the mobile or on the PC, right? And when I was doing the research for this session, I saw a mobile app. I can't remember the name now, but I saw a mobile app that helped in terms of storytelling development, either using the 3-act structure or any other act structure, right? Sometimes like slide tools. What other kind of, from your experience or from your experience at a big studio, what sort of tools are being used to help develop develop stories through this process with apps?
Yeah, so I mean, in big studios, you tend to have in-house tools, basically. So they will build tools from the ground up, and it might be new for that project, or it might be based on the engine of previous successful games, and iterate on that. So yeah, so it's not very helpful for people outside that studio, or but in terms of tools outside AAA, because that's the other thing, when you're in AAA, you only know what goes on in your studio. You don't know what happens in the other studios and exactly what tools they're using and how they work. So yeah, I'm terrified of ever moving to another studio and then having to learn this all over again. So yeah, I mean, in AAA, in my experience, you still write like a film script. That's my experience. So it looks like a screenplay, essentially. And then, you have like a tool that will help you like insert that into the engine for the game. But yeah, I suppose you could look at things like the way something like Ink, which is free and is written by the Inkle Games team, who did 80 Days. And Heaven's Vault. And so they've created this free sort of narrative tool, basically, for writing games that has a lot of really interesting functionality with it. There's so much you can do. Banner Saga was written using Ink. And yeah, so it's not, people think if you're doing using text-based tools like Twine or Ink or whatever it might be, that, you end up just with a wall of text and some words you can highlight. But Banner Saga is, like extremely stunning, I guess, sort of narrative, sort of real-time strategy game kind of thing. And yeah, so there's lots of cool stuff that you can do. You can have sort of like counters and timers, and there's lots of they're always updating it. And they did some really exciting development last year, and I can't remember what it is now, but I remember sort of the narrative sort of community was like, oh my God, what can we do with this? So yeah, and then that integrates with something like Unity, so it will integrate with an engine, and Unity is also free. And then you have things like Unreal, and there's so many tools out there now which are free, which makes it really accessible, and which is fantastic. I mean, I can't, like what, 10 years ago, like imagining the Unreal Engine being free, because it was just like the benchmark for sort of like 3D physics in games and stuff, and now it's free and indie developers use it to make games. And so it's incredible what is available, and there are all kinds of cool tools. And obviously, sort of new platforms like mobile, the birth of mobile is a huge way of bringing games to new audiences, and also making it accessible for developers, because lots of the world that doesn't have PCs will have phones, so they can make stuff on phones. Yeah, it's cool.
Great. Sounds like patches, updates, and bug fixes also come into
Right.
play when
Yeah.
for all these tools as well. All right. So let's talk a bit about the mobile and indie scene for
Mhm.
game development. Your experience with Before I Forget comes into mind. How is the process? How does the process differ when you're really looking at a mobile game and developing a story or the narrative part of a mobile game? Um, how does it differ from telling um, a AAA studio game, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I haven't developed for mobile, so but I can pretty much, sort of almost certainly say that the storytelling, the sort of nuts and bolts of storytelling. So, at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about story structure and the importance of character and setting and motivation and all those things. I mean, all those things still stand, they are sort of the nuts and bolts and heart of storytelling. I mean, what changes is the way you tell those stories. So, I mean, even mobile now, since we started making Before I Forget, the games you can get on mobile now is just, astonishing what you can play on mobile. So, so even, making games for mobile doesn't necessarily constrict you much in terms of storytelling at all. But in terms of indie, I think the big thing is budget and scope. And yeah, so basically, a lot of our choices were down to not having any money. We weren't funded. We were it was a side project. It was a passion project. So, we weren't going to be making a huge, sort of like physics based, like 3D epic open world adventure, because that was completely out of our grasp, financially. And also we didn't want to make a game like that. So yeah, so I think in terms of storytelling, one of the first things I realized of when I finished Before I Forget, or, I finished the writing on it and we were still in, post-production and production when I moved to Sweden to move into AAA. One of the first things I thought was, oh, wow, this is actually really like indie. Yeah, it's just like, okay, there's more people, teams are bigger, there's more money, things are flashier. The computers can run the game like really smoothly. Like neither Claire or I had a machine that would run our game at its best. So, but the sort of ebb and flow of development was the same. The problems and concerns were the same. Like, the sort of when you hit the nadir of the development of a creative project where you just don't know where it's going. Are you insane? Like, is anybody going to like this? I kind of hate it, so probably not. There's all those things where you just hit this wall where you think none of this is coming together. I don't know what to do, and you just kind of plug on, and then suddenly you pull out of that hole. And that was the thing that I found fascinating, that it was like, no matter the scale, those sort of like the nuts and bolts of the creative process are the same. you just have different sort of day-to-day concerns. You know, ours was, do we have enough money to go to that event to demo our game? You know, and with AAA, it's, you know, something different, you know, whether it's like third-party partners or what, or, you know, sort of development pipelines or whatever it might be. They're different concerns, but the sort of like ebb and flow of the creative process is the same.
Right. So before I forget, was nominated for BAFTA this year. What really inspired your decision to tell a story for people suffering from dementia? Before I forget.
Yeah, so fortunately, neither Claire or I have direct experience of dementia. You know, we haven't lost anyone to dementia or had to care for anyone or worked with people with dementia, which is a lot of people assume that, you know, it must come from personal experience, but it doesn't. So I met Claire at a game jam in Bristol, and I was always writing fiction before. This was the first game I ever wrote. And I was always fascinated with memory, basically, and what does it mean when someone loses their memory? You know, if someone has amnesia, some form of amnesia, what happens to that person? I saw a documentary and it just kind of fascinated me. This guy who woke up on a train and didn't know who he was or where he was. And, you know, people who met him when he did find his family, his personality had changed. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of fascinating. So it was always something I'd kind of had in the back of my mind as a story idea. And then when we individually, we didn't know each other, we were at the game jam and we got thrown together, and the theme was borders. And so we chucked around some ideas, and then I said, well, I have this idea for a woman with dementia, and then we can look at sort of mental borders as opposed to physical borders, and sort of psychological borders, and, you know, sort of that line between what is real and what is not, and things like that. And so, yeah, so that's how we came to make a game about dementia. Yeah, and I don't think we fully understood the responsibility or what we were taking on in that moment, but yeah, here we are.
Yeah, well, it's been a lifetime since that decision has been taken, and look at where it got you. It's been a great pleasure here. So final question before we wrap this up. How does anybody start getting into a career for narrative design or for story writing for games? And if I put some further context to that, thinking about it from an African perspective, whereby they don't have opportunities to get into game jams, or they don't have opportunities to get into gaming companies, either for indies or for bigger or for triple A titles. How does anyone start a career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is easier in the post-pandemic world, because everybody has been forced out of those physical spaces that, you know, that we had access to and other people did not. You know, things like big events like GDC. Nobody's flying to San Francisco and spending £2,000 just to get through the door. You know, it's all online. So I think hopefully the industry will take that as an opportunity, take this as an opportunity to increase accessibility to our events. And, you know, there are things like Global Game Jam, which is all done online. But obviously you need internet access for that. So yeah, there is an issue with that for sure. But I think there are things you can do. There are lots of resources online. Like GDC does have, you know, and there's Game Maker's Toolbox, which has, you know, there's lots of great talks that you can access if you can get online. or if you know someone who can. And then what I think would be good for people is to create their own communities, game development communities, and kind of learn together and learn from each other, and think small, just make a small thing, and, you know, sort of like finish something and have something that you can show. Because just making it, you'll learn things. You know, the lessons Claire and I have learned from Making Before I Forget, the things we would do differently. So I think, yeah, just create as much as you can. You know, if you can access, you know, the free tools that are out there, then, you know, look into them. You can make design games on paper as well. You can use paper, you know, there's a thing called paper design, and, you know, like flat games and things like that. So yeah, there is an app, a mobile app, I think it's called Flat Game Maker. But yeah, it's about taking pictures of the world around you, and then you can like create paths and move through these photos and create a game that way. And so that will help you with kind of game design. And then from a writing perspective, I think, yeah, just practice your writing. I mean, the good thing about being a writer is you can write no matter what. So yeah, you don't need the tools so much. But I think, yeah, try and forge a community. Find people who also want to make games, and yeah, sort of pool your knowledge and experience and learn together. I hope that's useful.
Will you say people with who've in the journalism field uh, have a sort of there is a sort of fine line between their skills in journalism and they telling stories, and those same stories coming. I mean, the practice of telling those stories for newspaper can be adopted for games as well. You see a fine line there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, yeah, my career as a journalist has helped me. I mean, you know, I was writing all the time, you know, it wasn't fiction, but, you know, I can see a hook in a story, like what is compelling about a story. I can write in different styles. I can write quite succinctly and clearly, and yeah, so any kind of writing you do. I was also a corporate copywriter, so, you know, writing websites for boring businesses. Yeah, I think any kind of writing you can do, if you're writing in another field but you want to write games, I think it's all still valid, definitely. It's all part of your toolkit as a writer. But yeah, I think analyze why some games work, or why some stories that you analyze them and see what, like, why they work. Why did everyone, I did this myself, why did everyone love Breaking Bad when it's really quite a horrific story, you know, about really dark subject matter, but everyone everyone's like grandmom, like brothers, like everybody likes Breaking Bad, and I was like, this is incredible because it's so dark. Why did everybody like this? And yeah, so sort of unpack that, like what is it that compelled us through that story, even though it's quite harrowing. Yeah, so I think you can always do more work to learn about your craft, but I think game development is definitely about being a community. I mean, Claire and I wouldn't be here without all the help and support and, you know, sort of just expertise and tips from everyone in, you know, the sort of indie game community. And yeah, so I used to have a writing group, and yeah, and I also had a game dev group. So it was just people, so it was friends I knew who kind of wanted to make games, but they weren't in the industry at all. They, you know, maybe worked in IT or didn't at all. They were stay-at-home mom or whatever. Yeah, and so we just used to sit around my dining table and like show and tell like stuff we'd made. It's as simple as that, basically. That's how you create your community.
Thank you for sharing. You've given us some ideas on how we could progress the craft locally, and this has been a great session. We thank you for your time. We thank you for believing in us to actually read our mail, our introductory note to you, and we thank you for actually taking time out to listen to what we had to say. This has been a great pleasure. Just one final thought, I know I said final thought before, but just one more. Any free resources you would like to give out in terms of thinking for narrative design, in terms of tools, free resource that you'd like to share?
Yeah, there's lots of resources. Yeah, so like I mentioned, Ink and Twine and Unity are great resources. Like if you have access to the internet and YouTube, the Game Makers Toolkit they do really, really great videos, and the GDC talks are also really great insight into some of your favorite games. Pock and Play has a Discord, so yeah, we have an online community of people from in the industry all over the world. So we'd love to have some African game developers or aspiring game developers in that space. That would be really great. So you can, yeah, if you find Pock and Play online, or we're on Twitter, I think we have it pinned to our Twitter account, like how to, you know, apply to be in our Discord channel.
Great, thank you very much, Chella. Wish
you.
you many more success on your journey.
Yeah, you too.
Hopefully in the future we'll reconnect and have a bigger session, or maybe ask you to advise some of our projects in the future. Looking forward to that. Thank you so much for this. This has been a great pleasure.
Yeah, good luck to everybody out there trying to make games.
All right, bye-bye. Have a great, do rest well and have a great time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.